Well, good evening, church. Good to see you here this evening as we have come together to worship God together, to learn about His Word. It is good to see you here tonight. Thank you for having me again. You didn't run me off after last week, so we'll see if we can look at God's Word tonight again and learn more about His Word from His world. I do commend you greatly for this topic that you've chosen to study in this series, the nature of God, learning about who God is, what He is like, what does He like, what does He do, and how we are supposed to respond to that. It's a great topic of study, and I greatly appreciate that you've chosen to study that. And as we've been looking at last week, we looked at what can we learn about the nature of God from His creation, from the very aspect of being able to look out into this world, look into our own bodies, into the things we think about and the things we spend time with, and how we can learn about His nature. We looked at the Bible's claim that in the beginning, God created. He created the heavens and the earth, and He created all that is listed in Genesis chapter 1, all that we know today. We looked at how God is the sovereign creator who fearfully and wonderfully created us and everything that we have a part in. This week, though, we're going to look at the nature of God from a different perspective, a perspective from the opposite viewpoint. We will consider God or chance. We'll consider how many around us consider that there is no God, that all things that we know came from chance, and it was chance that chance happened. And the idea that chance created is not a novel or a small idea anymore, unfortunately. Millions of people visit natural history museums in the U.S. This is just the one in New York, maybe the one in D.C., the Smithsonian National History Museum. Almost 5 million visitors in 1 year. Over 30 million people are going to visit a national history museum this year in the U.S., where they're going to be heavily teaching the doctrine of chance. The idea that over millions of years, life was evolved. Our society is almost completely steeped in this idea that evolution and thus chance created life, and that chance has driven all of life's formation ever since. However, also making the point that structure, order, and the complete lack of chaos behind the laws of nature were not chance, but yet they were driven by chance. Doesn't make sense. We're not alone in this idea, though. Almost 6 out of 10 Americans believe in chance. We're heavily steeped in this culture, in those around us, and even those who would claim Christ, who would claim God, will sometimes even believe this in order to feel that they're not alone. If you turn to Judges chapter 21, we'll look at an idea from there, and that's going to be our basis for looking at chance tonight, looking at evolution and trying our hardest to answer the question, God or chance. The time period of the Judges began after Joshua's death and after there was no more leadership in the people of Israel. They had received their promises, what they thought were their promises that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were living in their land. They were numerous people. But yet, what we see time and time again in the book of Judges is God's people deny Him, leave Him, and turn to sin and to their own pleasures and their own thoughts. Several times throughout the book of Judges, this idea is given, but in Judges chapter 21, verse 25, the very last book of the verse, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. Was there a king in Israel at this time during the period of the Judges?
Yes.
Who? God. Why then does the author of Judges record there was no king? They didn't act like it. They didn't think. Everyone, it says everyone did whatever seemed right to him. And even though the judges, they had their faults, they had their sins, but they were judges of righteousness. They were judges to bring God's people back to him. Were they included in that? Everyone will know. But yet what it seemed like to the author of Judges is that everyone in the land of Israel said there was no king, and they wanted to do what they thought was right. Whatever seemed right to him is what they did. And so I want to make this point clear that I think we learned from the story of the Judges is that society's rejection of God, of God's authority, in favor of bad human reasoning, does not justify my disbelief. Society's rejection of God's authority in favor of bad human reasoning does not justify my disbelief. And I use the word bad there on purpose. Are we supposed to use human reasoning? Are we supposed to use logic and understanding as we live our lives trying to figure out how we can serve God? I think the Bible is clear on that. I think we're supposed to. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, God tells Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." In the New Testament, Peter tells those who are in the dispersion in chapter 3, verse 15, to give a reason for their faith, for their hope. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason. What does it mean to reason? Think in a logical pattern, not just, like the Judges, not just thinking what they thought seemed right, but thinking what was right, thinking about truth, right? What does it mean in Timothy's case, in Peter's case, in 1 Peter chapter 3 here, to give a reason? What does that look like?
Give the why. Why do you have that hope in you?
Yeah, give the why. Give the logic. Give the truth. Give the understanding. Is the Christian faith a blind faith? I think absolutely not. The Christian is not someone who looks out into our world, sees a logical pattern, and then denies that to themselves because they refuse to accept the conclusions. And on the other side, they're not someone who looks out into this world and sees a logical pattern that follows truth, that makes sense, and then not follow that pattern and logic. I think we have to use our God-given abilities like we looked at last week, that we have the desire, we have the understanding and the abilities to think and reason to come to truth. When Jesus is praying for his disciples in John chapter 17, he prays specifically, sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. Why is truth so important in that moment to Jesus? He could have been praying about a lot of things, and he does pray about a lot of things. He spends a lot of time praying about other things that to us might have seemed more important, but yet Jesus was concerned about his disciples' ability to know truth, to come to truth, and as Peter says here, to share that truth. The Christian is not someone that takes in a reason half-heartedly on half-baked conclusions, half-baked observations with half-baked conclusions, and says, well, I'm too scared to look out into the science. I'm too scared to look out into evolution. I'm too scared to look out into all of the counter-arguments for God, because what if I find something that disproves God? What if I find something that says, well, they're right and God is wrong? The Christian is not someone who lets other things rule their lives other than God, like fear. John says in 1 John, perfect love casts out fear. And so the answer to our question tonight, God or chance, has drastic consequences for our lives and for our eternal state. Lots around us believe it was chance. What if they're right? What if they're wrong? And so the idea of chance, as we're looking at it, I want us to start off on this point, that this idea of chance, that all we know, all we will ever know, has simply been a low entropy state converting to a higher entropy state, thus they would call chance. That idea has never been validated, even by the most ardent supporters. In fact, over the past 5,000 years of recorded human history, whether that be from the ancient Chinese, the Sumerians, the Hittites, or the ancient Greeks, who many today would call the fathers and the creators of what we know today as science, none of them have ever observed an evolution or chance produce a new type of creation, a new type of life. Animals continue to reproduce according to their kinds, just as the Bible claims and prescribed for all of human history. We looked at last week in Genesis chapter 1 all of the days of creation and how the animals were created, the birds were created, the fruit-bearing trees and all the vegetation, and even the animals around us. They were created according to their kinds, and that's what we've witnessed. And so as millions continue to be steeped in so-claimed science and bad human reasoning around us, we have to ask why. We have to get to know that position, get to know that logic, and see if it is truth, to seek to understand their viewpoint. And so tonight we'll be looking at what is science, what is evolution, and are there any problems with that worldview. So we'll start off with what is science. Science literally means knowledge. It comes from the Latin word scientia, to know. Science is simply an organized and systemic approach to understanding the natural world through observation. Science is not an entity. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't do anything. It does not claim anything. When you read news reports or you're talking with your friends, what you'll often hear is, well, actually the science says this, or the science claims this, or researchers all agree on this. And if you've ever been a researcher, you know that never happens. But science is not an entity, nor is science bad. This is exactly what we talked about last week, being able to look through observation and come to a conclusion, understanding the natural world around us through observation. The ideas, the concepts, and all of the laws that we consider science, that we learn about in science classes, are considered scientific. They follow the method of science. If an idea then is not testable, repeatable, observable, or falsifiable, it is not scientific. If it is not testable, repeatable, observable, and falsifiable, if you can't repeat that conclusion, if you observe something but you can't ever observe it again, or if you observe it and then you do the experiment where you observe something again and you purposely try to make it appear different and it doesn't, that idea is not scientific, and we'll learn more about that later. And so much of what we're going to examine tonight, we're going to determine that science was really not involved, but rather something called naturalism. Naturalism is the idea that nature is all there is, and nature came from nature. In fact, recently the terms have kind of been becoming observable science and origins science, or historical science. Origin science is something that people look out and they see observations of what they think are observations, and they kind of piece together some different things, and then they make a conclusion on where life began, how it began. Observable science, on the other hand, is what puts men on the moon, what daily is used to create drugs like insulin and penicillin and different types of life-saving medical treatments. Observable science is when you go into a laboratory, you create an experiment, you design an experiment, you create a hypothesis of what you think is going to happen. You test that hypothesis with good experimental practices, and then you observe what happens, and you test your hypothesis. Whereas naturalism is the idea that the belief is that nature is all there is, and so therefore there has to be something that we're missing. And so we need to fill in those gaps in the science, in the observation. Naturalism is derived from this belief that nature is all there is, and that science can't describe all that we see and observe, and so we need to help it. We need to fill in those gaps. Science presumes that the universe is ordered. It follows rational and logical laws, physical laws. And this is true biblically. We looked last week at the Bible's claim is that God gave us the desire, remember? And that to find the order of the universe and to praise Him for it. Naturalism, on the other hand, presumes that nature created nature, and that nature is all there ever was and all there ever will be, but it can't answer questions even in the most ardent attempts, such as, where did the nature come from? Why does our universe have order if it started with no order? Why are our brains able to understand this so-called uncreated order then? Those are questions naturalism cannot explain. And many more would make the claim that creationists or Christians are actually the science deniers, that Christians and those who believe in a young, aged earth, they actually reject science because they don't want to fall into naturalism. They don't want to fall into the same tracks where you have to fill in the gaps. But that cannot be further from the truth. In fact, the founders of what we know today as science and call science, Francis Bacon, who is a politician but also a philosopher, many hundreds of years ago, created what we call today the scientific method, the observation hypothesis thesis method. Isaac Newton was a famous physicist. I'm sure you've heard of him. He created most of calculus. So if you had to take that in high school, you can blame him. And Gregor Mendel, who is the first one to really come up with a hypothesis and prove it on the theory of genetics, where genetics came from. He's the father of genetics is what most people call him. He created the foundation for what today is one of the massive pushes of science, is to know more about DNA and how it actually structures life. What's common about all three of these founders of science is they were all Christian. They were all creationists. They were all people whose ideas and theories were born of observation plus careful, repeatable experimentation plus testable conclusions. The actual science deniers are the naturalists. Those who combine observation, philosophical presuppositions, and speculation to create their conclusions. And what we'll see tonight is that just as creation is part of a religious worldview, evolution, chance, naturalism itself is part of a very predominant religious worldview around us. So what is evolution then? It's really not that simple of an answer, but it is a word that is used a lot. It's often misused, often used without context or poorly defined in the first place when it is used. But evolution can mostly be broken down into two main groups, macroevolution and microevolution. You might have heard the term special theory of evolution or general theory of evolution. Macroevolution is used to describe the large-scale changes which are believed to be able to turn a blob of protoplasm into a person, minerals to people. Theory, you might have think of like the apes to humans diagrams you've seen. This is what most people think about when they think about evolution. Microevolution, on the other hand, is intended to describe small-scale changes within a species population, such as those exhibited by Charles Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands in the 1850s. What Charles Darwin observed was microevolution on the Galapagos Islands. He observed that different types of finches on the different islands had different shaped beaks. And that was because on one island, the worms were deeper in the ground. On the other island, the finches mostly ate nuts or a different type of insect. And so the beaks would adapt or evolve, as he called it, over time to form, to fit their lifestyle in response to their environment. But what was common about all of these different finches, they were still finches. There were no new traits, major changes that took place to these finches, and the only observable evidence that Darwin considered in his 1952 On the Origin of Species is the variation that occurs within species of animals and plants. And so Darwin assumed that there was no limit to the variation among a species. Darwin said in his book, quote, "As the species of bears have entered the water, they have taken the character of the otter. And it is by accumulation of many slight variations that they have come to resemble the otter, both in structure and in habits." And so Darwin observed the bear, and he said that the bears have all different types of fur, different types of hair, different types of claws, different types of mouths meant for different purposes, such as polar bears, grizzly bears, black bears. They all have different types of traits, different types of characteristics. And so therefore, because those bears evolved over time to fit their habitat, to fit their environment, even though they're the same species, if you give it enough time, those bears must have then came from something that shared those common characteristics to best fit their environment. So he used the otter as an example. You think about the grizzly bears and the salmon-rich streams of Oregon, and the otters that also populate those same streams. Well, they're both waterproof. They both have vicious teeth for eating salmon. They both have webbed claws and feet, and so therefore they must share the same type of ancestry. And so Darwin extrapolated the observable but limited variation that occurs within the individuals of a species, like the black bear, the brown bear, the polar bear, into the unobservable evolution of fundamentally new animals. In Darwin's view, nature selects nature. Nature selects for traits that best promote survival. That's what he would call survival of the fittest, which is not in of itself incorrect. But yet Darwin's view was that based simply off of life or death, all life came to be. The famous evolutionist Carl Sagan said it took, quote, "lots of deaths in order to get us to where we are now. The secrets of evolution are time and death." We'll think about the death part later in the lesson. And so evolutionists like to use the observable, the observations of microevolution, and extrapolate those observations into something called macroevolution. To take microevolution and the evidence for it that a black bear does have different traits than a brown bear, and use that as evidence for macroevolution, for large-scale changes of species into completely new species or kinds. But there is, in fact, no known relationship between macroevolution and microevolution. This is accepted in the scientific community, and there is mostly consensus on this by evolutionists themselves. You never know it by the way the media, textbooks, and anyone you've ever had a conversation with on social media talk about it, though. But in the Chicago conference in 1982, there was a big conference on what is the driving mechanism of evolution. Is it microevolution? Is it macroevolution? Is it mutations in genetic code? And they answered this question, quote, "The central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanisms of microevolution could be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. At the expense of doing violence to the positions of some people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no." Well, surely in the past 45 years since then, more evidence has been created, more papers have been written, and more research in laboratories has been done. More hours at the library has been spent postulating and thinking about how to answer this question with yes, and the consensus is still no today. There is no known link between macroevolution and microevolution. Many, just as they did in 1982, will claim there is, but within their claims lies solely microevolution. And what you'll hear this today called is mutations. That mutations in genetic code is the driving force. Mutations are nothing different than microevolution in of themselves. And so since the rapid increase then in evolutionary thought of the 1850s, that's what the history of evolution has been like. Since the rapid increase of this from the 1850s, because of Darwin's publication, I'd say there's three main challenges that have come to fruition since. The first is the diversity of life from genetics. Since 1859, mankind has discovered hundreds of thousands of new species. In 1859, we knew of between 150,000 to 200,000 on the upper end species of organisms that we could classify formally. Today, 1.5 million to 2 million species have been formally described, and the estimate of species that are out there is on the 1 billion side of the scale. And so that means Darwin knew just 10% of the evidence we have today. 10% is all he had. That'd be like someone claiming that as soon as the polls in Florida close, that they know who's going to win the upcoming election because of how Florida voted, or because of how Arizona or Pennsylvania vote. It just doesn't work like that. You can't make conclusions on 10% of the evidence that still remain conclusions when more evidence comes out. The second main downfall is that just 7 years after the On the Origins of Species published, Gregor Mendel published his famous pea plant hypothesis, genetics research, which claimed that species are defined by their traits. Gregor Mendel's work on genetics was groundbreaking at the time, and all he really wanted to do was grow a better pea plant. He wanted it to have the right characteristics. He didn't want it to have too much water. He wanted it to be able to grow in a desert or in a jungle or wherever it was going to grow, and he wanted to know why different plants grow differently and how we can best domesticate those plants in order to provide food for us, in order to provide all different types of things for us. And so Gregor Mendel's research came to the conclusion that species are defined by their traits. But yet traits, he would also postulate, are inherited consistently from generation to generation. They don't just come into the code. And so in other words, species are defined by inheritance. And that is also what was discovered in 1959, almost 100 years later, when the first genetic sequence of DNA was completed. We inherit our genetic code from our parents, who inherited their genetic code from their parents, who inherited their genetic code from their parents, and that all of the traits that make us human, our fingers, our eyes, our hair, all of those things have not changed from generation to generation. There are mutations in the genetic code. Think about cancer. Cancer is a misreplication of RNA, which is a terrible disease, causes tons of problems for millions of people around the world every day. But yet that cancer is not inherited from generation to generation. And so cancer is then not a trait of human. And so Darwin attempted to answer here a genetic question before genetics was even born. And so why do so many people today follow his same train of thinking, his same line of reasoning? And then lastly, Darwin did not prove evolution. It's still not proven today. Rather, Darwin attempted to disprove competing ideas of his day, which is not a bad thing to do. That's what peer review is. Someone publishes a paper within the research world, within the scientific community. All people, if it's something interesting, all scientists everywhere are going to go, yeah, I bet you didn't do that, because they want their name on the paper. They want their name in the history books for actually proving something different. Or if someone comes out in the scientific community and says, well, actually, this thing that we've been saying is true for the past thousands of years isn't true, then all of a sudden you have tons of people all around the world saying, well, yeah, but you're actually wrong, because that would mean their line of work for the past decades have been wrong. And so Darwin did that same thing. He engaged in a peer review process with his publication On the Origin of Species. He attempted to disprove competing ideas of his day, but he never proved evolution. He simply posed it as a question. And so what about today, though? We read, hear, and watch all of the claims of evolutionists that say evolution did happen. It's treated as a fact in classrooms. It's treated as a fact in colleges and universities. It's treated as a fact on the TV, on YouTube, on Facebook, that there is undeniable proof of evolution. In fact, I'm sure you've seen this claim that we're 98% or 99% similar to a chimpanzee in our DNA sequence. Even when I was a kid, I remember thinking, and that was one of the problems that I had with coming to God was, well, why are we so similar to so many different animals? Because this claim is everywhere, 98% similar to chimpanzees. And so this idea that because we're so similar in our DNA, that means that at some point millions of years ago, we shared a common ancestor because we had the same DNA, and it was split off over time, and we eventually evolved into two different species, but yet we still shared that common bond. And so let's look at the science of this claim, though. Let's begin with the genomes of humans and chimps. Humans, the genetic code is made up of DNA. DNA you can think of as letters. So you have A, B, C, D on one side, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 on the other side. All those different letters and numbers can kind of mix together, and they form strands. They pair together. They're called genetic bonds, those DNA pairs. And then they form these huge lines of genetic information. That's what we call DNA. And they shrivel up, and they kind of look like a pot of spaghetti sitting on the stove. And so all of that DNA, those base pairs, the genetic pairs, humans have 3.097 billion of those combinations in just one strand of DNA of our genetic makeup. In one cell, there's that many pairs, base pairs of DNA. A chimpanzee has 3.231 billion base pairs of DNA, which means that chimpanzees have 4.3% more base pairs in their genetic code than humans do. Does anyone see a problem with this so far?
It would be presumed that if you had more base pairs, you would have more a result of more advancement.
Yeah, at least significantly different, and that's what we do see. Chimpanzees are significantly different than us. They almost share no qualities as far as human reasoning and logic and the ability to think goes. Chimpanzee DNA sequence is 4% larger than humans, but yet we're 98% similar. So where'd the 2% go? Shouldn't it be at least 4.3% different if theirs is larger than ours? How's it possible? Well, the 98% number actually comes from comparing sections of DNA that are similar, that are overlap with chimpanzees. Large sections of both genomes were left out because they were too insimilar to even compare the base pairs. So imagine you write a book on this side, and then you compare it to a different book on this side, and then you analyze each of those words in a paragraph. And if the words don't really mix up, you throw out all of the paragraphs that don't mix up. About 25% of our DNA code was left out in this comparison. 18% of chimpanzee DNA was left out in their genetic base pairs. And so researchers have now shown that the maximum similarity between human DNA and chimpanzee DNA, or genetic code, is actually around the 84% similarity number. And that may still seem a lot to you, but 84% is the same amount as a mouse, a cow, and a dog. So it doesn't really make sense, the common ancestor comparison. And so that number, 84%, again ignores a large section of DNA that is just completely incompatible to even compare in the first place. And so the actual estimate is probably much lower than 84%, probably around 80 to 81%. So 98% similar down to 84% similar, far too many genetic differences to share a common ancestor. Instead, what we see between humans and chimpanzees are two creations who share the nature of their creator. Two creations that share the signature of their creator, the mark, the stamp of his craftsmanship, his signature of their DNA. Something else we hear about is, what about all the interspecies fossils that have been found? What about all the fossils that show that at some point between chimpanzees and humans there were other species who were evolved from the chimpanzees or from the apes, who had similar human characteristics, but they weren't human, and they weren't ape, they weren't chimpanzee or something else. What about all of those fossils? Well, there really aren't any. There's been no fossil that shows a interspecies evolution. Lucy is one of the famous ones. I wouldn't say it is the most evident, but it is the one that's always promoted in natural history museums and different types of evolutionist brainwashing campaigns. But Lucy is a Australopithecus afarensis. It was found in Africa. It is a female skeletal remains. And this is probably the leading specimen for the Australopithecus species of what is claimed to be that. And it was pieced together from lots of bones that were excavated over a 9-foot area. Probably close to 140 bones, I think, over that 9-foot area. And then they glued all the different fragments and bone pieces together, and that formed 47 skeletal pieces. That's all that we actually have on the left there. 47 skeletal pieces from all different types of bone fragments that were sifted through 20 tons of sediment over a 160-foot area. That's bigger than this room. And they only found 20% of the bones of so-called this new interspecies example of evolution. You can see here the skull on the right. That's all we have of the skull, but yet when you walk into a museum, the first thing you'll see is a replication of what they think Lucy looked like on the bottom here. You notice what's different about her eyes than other chimpanzees or different apes? Do you know? Let's see, pull up this picture again. You notice what's different about the outside of this chimpanzee's eyes compared to Lucy?
Sunk in. It looked like, didn't it?
Eyes sunk in. What about the actual eyes as well?
Go back to it.
She has eye whites.
Yes, what?
Eye whites. Whites around her pupils and around the actual eyes. Lucy, no eyes were found. In fact, that's all the skull fragments we have. No way to tell there were whites in her eyes, and that's one of the defining features between an ape and a human. We have whites in our eyes, apes don't. But yet when you walk into a museum, what you see is whites in these replications' eyes. When you look at their feet in the museum, what you'll see is a remarkably human foot, probably around a size 12 male foot. And by the way, Lucy is 3'6", so very large feet. And actually, when you search her picture, what you'll see is that they've shaven her body just to make her seem even more human-like. And they've put small babies on her back, or they've even created male of these species, which they found some fossils which they claim is a male, but nowhere near as many as Lucy, and that's saying a lot. And so what we've seen throughout the past 10 or so years, since this has really taken off, is that one of the bones of Lucy, do I have a laser pointer? Yeah, one of the bones, one of the vertebrae, that one right there, was actually determined to be an extinct type of baboon's vertebrae that they mistakenly included in her skeletal remains. But yet, as in this picture, that bone still remains in all of the displays worldwide, even though it's known to be chimp-like. If you look at Lucy's skull, it's so incomplete that most of it is made of imagination and plaster of Paris, is what one researcher quoted in one of his articles about Lucy's skull. This is Lucy's skull here compared to a modern-day bonobos skull, which is an African ape-like creature, about 3'6". Very, very, very similar to Lucy's skeletal remains. Lucy is undoubtedly a terrible example of an interspecies evolutionary fossil, and that is not a creationist or a Christian viewpoint. Much of the scientific community, much of archaeologists would actually say the same and do say the same. A lot more could be said about Lucy, But we'll move on to another example, which is radiometric dating. The current estimate by evolutionists and deep time thinkers is that the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And I guess when you're talking billions, the 100th place is important. So 4.54 billion years old. But where does that number come from? Well, initially it came from, evolution needed time to take place, and then it was desired that the Earth be old. And so there needed to be a way to find out how old is the Earth. And so the process that is done is radiometric dating. Radiometric dating works by measuring the ratio of parent isotopes to their decay products. It's an ordinary differential equation derived pretty simply, but you get the ending amount by taking the starting amount and multiplying it by E, which is a constant to the lambda t power, where lambda is the decay rate, or 0.693 plus tau to the half, or the half-life of that specimen. And so radiometric dating compares how much we have now. Say you have a chunk of carbon. How much carbon do we have now? And so we'll have to estimate either its decay rate, or we'll have to estimate how much carbon there was initially. That's the A0 in that equation. There are problems with that method, though. As I said, estimation is the name of the game. Faulty initial conditions give faulty answers. Is radiometric dating accurate? Yes, assuming all of the assumptions that go into it have been assumed correctly. The other problem with radiometric dating is contamination. What if you had a chunk of carbon that is exposed maybe 10 feet below the surface that you think is from a volcanic activity or something like that? What if groundwater got down in 10 feet below the surface? What if earthquakes happened that exposed the surface, and then later on the surface was recovered later on? What if a natural disaster like a tornado or a hurricane came over, uncovered the soil, and then it recovered itself over time? Contamination is a big problem with radiometric dating. And these examples are from known rock ages show that. On the left, you see the actual date of when that rock is from. So, for instance, with the Oregon Cascades rocks, we know when that volcano erupted. We know when that lava was formed. Less than 1,000 years ago, but yet when it's dated with scientific presuppositions, it's 1.5 million years old. Wrong initial conditions, wrong contamination, something went wrong in their assumptions. And see, there can be problems with this thinking. Evolution is not the best worldview. What you'll hear from many evolutionists and many of those who acclaim science but are actually naturalists is that they say evolution is the only worldview, and they might admit that there's flaws with it, but it's the best worldview. It's the best of the options we have. Based on the science, I would say it's not the best worldview. And just a couple of other things. Irreducible complexity. You think about the motor that drives the flagellum tail of a simple single-celled bacteria. That tail is incredibly complex, more complex than what we've been able to do in the past 200 years in mechanical engineering. Super complex. But yet, if this bacteria didn't have this tail, it wouldn't be able to move and eat and do all the things it needs to do. This tail spins very quickly, thousands of times per second, in order to move around, and it kind of wiggles around. You'll see under a microscope. Well, if this bacteria didn't have this, there would be no life for that bacteria. And so how did something like this evolve over time? And then recently, what's been coming out in creationist research and science, where naturalism is not the only answer, is that mitochondrial DNA has been showing that all humans share a common ancestor. but it's not from the apes. It's not from chimpanzees. It's human ancestry, and that's determined by mitochondrial DNA, which is determined by the maternal side of that individual. All humans share a common ancestor, perhaps someone like Adam and Eve or Noah and his wife. And so many today, even seeing the flaws of evolution and the naturalist position around us, don't want to be left out from the majority. Just like in Judges chapter 21, where the author says there was no king in Israel. Everyone did right in his own eyes. Many today want to do what's right in society's eyes, but yet they also want to cling on to God. And so many come up with positions, well, God created the Big Bang and therefore created the process of evolution, or that God created apes in Adam and Eve, and then it took millions of years for each day instead of literal days for the process of evolution to take place. Evolution is not compatible with Christianity and its creationist world view. In Genesis chapter 2, the very first warning from God about sin, you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for the day you eat from it, you will certainly die. Do you remember what Carl Sanger said about evolution and what drove evolution? Time and death. But yet here in Genesis chapter 2, death is the result from what? Sin. In Romans chapter 5, Paul says a similar idea in verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death spread to all people because all sinned. Death is because of sin, not to drive change. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says again, for since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. Do you see the problem with theistic evolution, or evolution that wants to cling on to God to some degree? There can be no sin before, or there can be no death before sin. And so how is it that millions of years of death and decay, whether that be plant, insect, sea life, bird life, animal life, there was no death, but yet death came through sin? How can there be death with no sin under the Christian's worldview? But yet death was not the end-all, be-all of creation. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve sin against God because of the serpent's lies. They eat of the tree that God clearly told them they would die if they ate of. And because they sinned, death entered the world, and death has been the ruling characteristic of our lives since. We know we're going to be born, we know we're going to die, and we know something's going to happen in between. And because of that sin, because of that death, we haven't only physically died, but we've also been spiritually dead. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, Peter says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. The viewpoint of evolution and the viewpoint of naturalism around us is that all we are the byproducts of chance that resulted from chance. But yet God's point of view is that we're the byproducts of a purposeful creation that was done in his image, that we might learn about his nature and replicate his nature, so that one day we can share in his nature fully formed in the image of God in heaven with him. But yet we've sinned. We've gone against him. We've brought death into the world through Adam, and through each one of us we've sinned and we've brought death. But yet the promise of Jesus, the promise of God, is that death can be taken away, that death can be turned into immortality. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, by Christ's wounds we are healed. Death is taken away, and we will live eternally with our Creator in his nature. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Doesn't that sound exactly what we were created to do and to live now? The question is, are you going to live now in his nature? Are you going to put on Christ? Are you going to fulfill the obligations that you were created to live under and as? If we can help you tonight, I know there's water here to be baptized. If you need to learn about what the process of becoming a Christian is, if you need to be helped or to be prayed with, if you have been a Christian but you've strayed from Him, but you've strayed from Christ and you've brought death back into your life, I'm sure we can help you tonight. If there's anything we can do to help you, to talk with you, if you need to be baptized tonight, will you come right now as we stand and sing?